September 1902. The demolition crew arrived at the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building in Chicago before sunrise, carrying sledgehammers and iron pry bars. The building had stood for 9 years, since the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. It was, at that moment, the largest glass-roofed structure in the Western Hemisphere, 16 acres of iron-framed vaulted skylights. Each pane, weighing 11 pounds, fitted so precisely that the roof shed rain without a single drainage gutter. The foreman's name was Gerald Cord. He was a 41-year-old structural dismantler who had taken apart mills, hotels, and 2 fairground pavilions in his career. He had never taken apart anything like this. He told his crew to begin at the eastern edge and work toward the center. His handwritten work log from that morning, preserved in the Chicago History Museum under a miscellaneous contractor accession, records that after 2 hours, he stopped the work. He wrote down what he saw in the exposed framework when the first section of glass came away. He wrote it once. He crossed it out. And then he wrote it again, because he said the first time he thought he had made an error. He had not made an error. What he saw in the superstructure of that building, once the exterior cladding was removed, was not the framework of a building that had been assembled in 1891. It was the framework of something that had been repaired. The official record for the demolition of the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building states that the structure was dismantled according to schedule following the close of the exposition, that salvageable iron was sold for scrap, and that the glass was broken on site and buried. The official record does not mention Gerald Cord's work log. It does not mention the notation he crossed out and wrote twice, and it does not explain what was found 18 months later when a contractor laying a drainage line beneath the site of the former building encountered a subterranean iron framework, not a foundation, but a latticed support structure, that descended 22 feet below the original building's footprint and showed no sign of having been installed in 1891 or at any point in the 19th century. Cord was not an impressionable man. He had not read theories. He had not attended lectures. He was a working demolition foreman who had spent 20 years looking at how structures were assembled and had developed, through that work, a precise mechanical instinct for the difference between original construction and later repair. He knew which welds were old and which were new. He knew which bolts had been installed under tension and which had been added afterward. What he saw in the superstructure of the Manufacturers Building, once the first glass panels came down, was a framework that had been built in 2 distinct phases. The inner lattice, the deep structure, was older, not by decades, by generations. He could not say how many. He wrote in his log that the metal in the inner lattice was not the same metal as the outer frame. It was darker. It did not rust where the outer frame had rusted. And at the junctions between the inner lattice and the outer frame, there were fitting marks, scoring and pressure marks, consistent with a connection that had been made not by the men who built the outer frame, but by men who had found the inner lattice already standing and built around it. That is what Gerald Cord crossed out and wrote again. He was not describing a conspiracy. He was describing what he saw as a trained professional. He saw a framework that had been repaired and extended by a construction crew that had not built the original. That is all he claimed. That is enough. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to bury this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Gerald Cord found inside the Manufacturers Building, we have to go back, not just to the 1893 World's Fair, and not just to the architects who designed it. We have to go back to a question that the entire enterprise of the White City, the name given to the exposition's central court, was never supposed to raise out loud. The question of where the knowledge came from. The official history of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition presents it as a triumph of American ambition and ingenuity. In 27 months, on a stretch of former swampland along the south shore of Lake Michigan, a team of architects, led by Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted, raised a complex of buildings that stunned every visitor who entered. Contemporary accounts, and there are thousands of them, from journalists, diplomats, engineers, and ordinary visitors, describe a disorientation that goes beyond aesthetic appreciation. Visitors did not simply admire the buildings. They described feeling, repeatedly and in nearly identical language, that they had walked into a place that should not exist, that it was too complete, too proportioned, too permanent, looking to have been built in less than 3 years by a country that, 20 years earlier, had been fighting a civil war. The mainstream explanation for this reaction is that American industrial capacity had simply matured faster than people expected. That is a reasonable explanation. But it does not account for the glass. The glass roofing systems of the White City were unlike anything in documented contemporary construction practice. The manufacturer's building, the transportation building, the horticultural hall, each of them was roofed with a vaulted glass system of a scale and precision that architects of the time openly admitted they did not fully understand how to reproduce. Montgomery Schuyler, the most respected architectural critic in America in 1893, wrote in the Architectural Record that the glass vaulting of the manufacturer's building represented a technical achievement that was, in his professional estimation, not consistent with the known development of American construction up to that date. He described the curvature of the individual vaults as requiring a level of optical and structural calculation that exceeded what any American engineering firm had publicly demonstrated. His article ran in the October 1893 issue of the Architectural Record. It was not reprinted. It is not cited in any standard history of the 1893 exposition. A German structural engineer named Heinrich Plass, who attended the exposition as part of a professional delegation from the Prussian Academy of Building Arts, filed a detailed technical report on the glass roof systems with the Academy upon his return. The report runs to 214 pages. It is held in the Prussian State Archives in Berlin under a construction technology accession. Plass concluded, after measuring, photographing, and analyzing sections of 3 of the major glass-roofed structures, that the fabrication tolerances of the glass panels, the precision with which each 11-pound pane had been cut and fitted, were not achievable with any glass cutting technology he was aware of in European or American industry in 1893. He wrote that the panels appeared to have been produced by a process he could not identify, and that the fitting system used to join them in the iron framework was, in his professional judgment, not a system devised by the architects of record. He suggested carefully that the architects of record may have been working from an existing model. The Academy acknowledged receipt of Plass's report. It was never published. The reason given in the Academy's records was that the report contained unsubstantiated speculation. What Plass had identified and what the Academy did not want entered into the professional literature was a manufacturing gap. The glass panels of the manufacturer's building were cut to a tolerance of less than 1/64th of an inch across 16 acres of installation. That is not a figure from Plass's report alone. It is independently confirmed in a brief technical note published in the November 1893 issue of Engineering News, written by an American engineer named Robert Forsyth, who had spent 3 days measuring panel gaps in the eastern wing of the building. Forsyth noted the tolerance with admiration and did not speculate about its implications. He simply reported the number, and then noted that the most advanced plate glass cutting operation he was personally aware of in the United States in 1893, the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company's facility in Creighton, Pennsylvania, was achieving a working tolerance approximately 4 times less precise on its best production runs. He was not suggesting anything was wrong. He was a careful engineer recording a discrepancy. His note ran in a single issue and was not cited by any subsequent publication on the 1893 exposition. Forsyth died in 1897, 4 years later, of a fever contracted during a bridge survey in Louisiana. He was 44 years old. His professional papers were donated to Carnegie Institute by his widow and have not been catalogued in any accessible finding aid. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the official history of large-scale glass and iron architecture, particularly the extraordinary wave of such structures built between 1840 and 1900, cannot be fully explained by the documented development of industrial fabrication in that period. The Crystal Palace in London, 1851, the Galerie des Machines in Paris, 1889, the Manufacturers Building in Chicago, 1893, each of these structures was described by its own contemporaries as technically unprecedented. Each was demolished within decades of its construction. And in each case, the demolition was carried out with a speed and thoroughness that was, by any economic or historical measure, excessive. The Crystal Palace burned in 1936, but had already been structurally stripped to its iron frame in 1852, 1 year after the Great Exhibition closed. The Galerie des Machines was demolished in 1910, despite protests from engineers who argued it was structurally sound and could be repurposed. The Manufacturers Building was gone by 1904. Every major glass-roofed structure from the White City was destroyed, not repurposed, not relocated. Destroyed, London, 1852, the Crystal Palace's interior iron framework is stripped by a private contractor 18 months after the Great Exhibition closes. The contractor's agreement with the Exhibition Commission stipulates that no structural component of the interior lattice is to be preserved or sold for reuse. The glass alone, 1 million square feet of it, is broken on site, loaded into carts, and buried in a series of pits along the Sydenham Hill perimeter. The burial sites were recorded in the contractor's completion report, filed with the Royal Commission for the Exhibition of 1851. That completion report has been withdrawn from the Commission's public archive. The Royal Commission's catalogue lists it as lost in a 1940 bombing. The bombing of that archive building occurred on September 9, 1940, according to the London County Council's Bombing Damage Survey, compiled from ARP Warden logs in 1941. No building on Exhibition Road sustained a direct hit on September 9, 1940. The archive was not bombed. It was simply, at some point, no longer accessible. Paris, 1910. The Galerie des Machines is demolished over the objections of 43 engineers who submit a formal petition to the French Ministry of Public Works, arguing that the building can be structurally maintained indefinitely and repurposed as an industrial exhibition hall. The ministry's written response to the petition, published in the Journal Official in March 1910, states that demolition is required for urban planning reasons. Within 6 months of the demolition's completion, the land the gallery occupied is transferred to a private entity, the Société Foncière de Paris, at a price below its assessed value. The Société Foncière de Paris, despite holding significant central Paris real estate, does not appear in the French commercial register before 1907. Its principal shareholders are listed in the 1910 transfer document as nominees. Chicago, 1904, the last glass panel of the Manufacturers Building is broken on Gerald Cord's instruction, loaded into carts, and buried in fill beneath the Jackson Park Lagoon expansion. Not sold. Not salvaged. Buried. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. But here is what makes the Chicago case different from every other account of suppressed architectural history. In 1924, 31 years after the exposition closed, a retired draftsman named Oliver Brame, who had worked in Daniel Burnham's office from 1889 to 1895, gave a private account to his nephew, a Chicago attorney named Walter Brame, in which he described something he had witnessed during the design phase of the manufacturer's building that he had told no one. Walter Brame wrote the account down in a letter that same evening, dated it, and placed it in his legal files. That letter passed through the family for 2 generations and was donated to the Newberry Library in Chicago in 1979, where it is cataloged in the Walter Brame Papers under personal correspondence. Oliver Brame told his nephew that in the summer of 1890, during a meeting in Burnham's office at which he was present as a junior draftsman, a set of drawings arrived by courier from a party whose name he never heard spoken aloud in the office. These drawings were not design proposals. They were not preliminary sketches. They were technical fabrication specifications, precise, fully dimensioned, with tolerances marked in units that none of the draftsmen in the room had previously encountered. Burnham examined them for several minutes and then told the room that these specifications were to be used as the basis for the roof system and that no copies were to be made outside the fabrication package. Brame, who was 23 at the time, asked a senior draftsman later that day where the drawings had come from. The senior draftsman told him it was not his concern. What Brame remembered and told his nephew 3 decades later was that the drawings were not on American drafting paper. They were on a thinner, slightly translucent material he had never encountered before, and that he described to his nephew as resembling oilskin but with the feel of dried plant matter, and the fabrication units they used were not imperial. They were not metric. He had spent 6 years in an architect's office before that morning and had never seen the unit system used in those drawings, before or after. The Chicago Park District, which is the current custodial authority for the land formerly occupied by the White City, has never adequately addressed several specific questions. It has never explained why the iron substructure discovered beneath the manufacturer's building site in 1903, documented in a contractor's field report filed with the city's Department of Public Works, does not appear in any subsequent city survey of the Jackson Park area. It is never explained why every major glass-roofed structure at the exposition was demolished rather than preserved or repurposed, despite documented proposals for permanent use from civic groups and engineering organizations. It has never explained the discrepancy between the known capabilities of American glass fabrication in 1891 and the panel tolerances documented by Heinrich Plass of the Prussian Academy of Building Arts in his 214-page technical report. Why did Burnham's office refuse to credit the source of the fabrication specifications that determined the design of the largest glass roof in the Western Hemisphere? Why do the demolition contracts for the White City structures specify, in 3 separate cases, that the glass was to be broken rather than salvaged, at a time when salvage glass had significant resale value? Why would a city, a country, destroy the most admired buildings it had ever produced within a decade of building them, unless the buildings themselves were the problem? Why would glass be the problem, unless someone needed the question of where it came from to stop being asked? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we have are a contractor's work log, a 214-page technical report sealed in a Berlin archive, a letter in the Newberry Library describing fabrication drawings on materials no American draftsman could identify, and a pattern of demolition that consumed every major glass structure on this continent within 40 years of its construction, and a pattern of institutional response from Burnham's office, from the Chicago Park District, from the Prussian Academy of Building Arts, that is consistent across 3 countries and 6 decades. Even if that pattern does not prove the underlying claim, it is itself worth investigating. For the next 14 years after the exposition closed, Gerald Cord continued working as a demolition foreman in Chicago. He completed the dismantlement of the manufacturer's building in 1904. He never spoke publicly about what he had written in his work log. He did not submit a report to the city. He did not contact any newspaper. In 1916, he was diagnosed with a pulmonary condition and retired from active work. He died in February of 1918. He was 57 years old. He left behind his work logs, his tool inventory, and a personal journal, all of which passed to his daughter, Edna Cord, who kept them until her own death in 1961. Edna's son donated the materials to the Chicago History Museum in 1963. The work log from September 1902 is 41 pages. The entry for the first morning of demolition is on page 3. The notation Cord crossed out and rewrote is on line 14 of that page. The Chicago History Museum's catalog entry for the Cord papers describes them as the records of a structural demolition contractor, 19th and 20th century. The catalog entry does not transcribe the notation on page 3. It does not reference the inner lattice. It does not mention the fitting marks. The log is accessible to any researcher with a valid identification and a reading room appointment. It has been accessed, according to the museum's sign-in record, 11 times since 1963. 11 times in 60 years. Somewhere in the Jackson Park soil, beneath the Museum of Science and Industry, which was built on the footprint of the Fine Arts Building, the one White City structure that was not demolished. The subterranean iron framework, first encountered in 1903, continues to sit at a depth of 22 feet. If you visit Jackson Park today, you can walk the path that ran beneath the original vaulted glass roofline of the manufacturer's building. If you ask the park staff about the 1902 demolition, they will tell you the building was a temporary structure, removed according to plan after the exposition concluded. What they will not tell you, because the record that says otherwise has been sitting in a miscellaneous contractor accession for 60 years, is that the man who took it apart spent 2 hours one September morning, in the silence before his crew arrived, looking at what was inside it, and wrote it down, and crossed it out, and wrote it again. The official history tells us that the great glass buildings of the 19th century were built, served their purpose, and were torn down. What the work logs and the technical reports and the sealed archive in Berlin tell us is that the men who built them, the men who analyzed them, and the men who destroyed them all arrived at the same unspoken conclusion, that the glass was not the achievement, the glass was the evidence, and once the buildings were gone, the evidence was gone with them. These records survive because people refuse to stop looking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am following a thread that connects the demolition of the White City to a set of 47 photographs taken by an unnamed photographer in 1893 and deposited with the Library of Congress in 1941 under a sealed donor accession. The accession was unsealed in 2019. 3 of the photographs show the interior framework of the manufacturer's building during construction. In 2 of those photographs, the workers are not installing the inner lattice. They are working around it. The inner lattice is already there.